Alright, so today we're going to be doing something that's not quite technically architecture, but because we have to build everything in this game, I'm going to count it, is tents. So marquee styles, camping styles, and then a big yurt style tent as well. So these were really fun to make, and once you get the hang of it, it's not as hard as it looks. And so we're going to start with the small tents because they are essentially just a smaller version of this. It just requires a little bit more finessing for that one. So we'll start with the camping style tents to get an understanding of how this is going to work. So 7 high might feel very high, but it's actually not too high once you start. And what we want to do is go 7 high, and then we're going to do a plus shape cross of one style, and then the corners will be another style. So on the cross shape, we're going to go down in levels of 2, and then at the bottom, we're going to go down in 1 to taper down to the bottom. So we want to do that all the way along for each of the 4 points, and it is a good idea to do each of the different sections completely first because it's a bit of a trick to the eye sometimes working this out. And then the corner parts, all we need to do is go in and we want to stop each layer at the opposite layer to what the plus cross shape is. So the next line you'll see that there'll always be 2 down from the previous line. And so this is one of the ways to get a conical type of shape. I've seen other people do it other ways, and I'm learning from the ways other people do it, but this is the way that I've found. And this creates slightly sort of inward curving, so it is conical, but it's a little bit more of a spire shape, which is why it works for these tents, but it'll also work for a roof. And we can do one as well that is one shorter. So if we go up 6, and then same idea, we're going to go down 2. And there's only going to be room for 1, but once we put the whole thing out, we'll see that that's actually still a good conical shape. It's a little easier to do it with different colours to differentiate, and you can always go back and use your trowel before you chisel everything to make it all the same colour if you want, but it's also nice and interesting to have the different colours like we've seen. And then now we're ready to chisel. So the other reason it's a good idea to have 2 different colours is to, when you're practicing, work out what you're chiseling. So on the cross shape, we're going to chisel diagonally straight on. And on the corners, we're going to diagonally chisel corner pieces for all of them. So as well, if you want to give it a little bit more of a tent vibe, you can go out an extra block at the bottom for these ones and chisel that down diagonally as well, and that'll give it more of a sort of material looking effect, like it's a bit more of a tent. So like I was saying, this is definitely something that you'll use for roofs. Originally I had, as you can see, been practicing with mud brick to make tower roofs. So you can use this same system for that, but later down the track I'll also just do a video testing the different ways we can chisel towers up. But for now, we want to make this a little bit more tent-like, so we're going to change the front a bit so that we have an entranceway. 2 blocks is probably the maximum you'd want to go on something this size without it looking oversized, the front part. And just remember, if you want to put anything like bunting or curtains, you'll need to just replace the rope with a block like chalk and put them down and then delete it. So for that front piece, all we did is a 3x2 and chiseled up the sides, and we'll go put the rope back in later, but this is going to be just big enough for a tiny bedroom. It ends up, once we put a door on it, that it is 5 squares. So you might have to play around with your tents just to see what will actually register as a room, but that gives us just enough to have a bedroll, a chair, a nameplate and a light, which is all we need for a bedroom. So my 2 tents now over in my forest have villagers in them, which is great. And just quickly, a little pyramid tent, just to show that it's easy to give that camping theme if you use the right materials. Next on the list is a marquee tent, just a square or a rectangle one, and to do that we want to use some probably wooden pillars, and because we're probably going to have curtains on it, we want to fill it up with chalk or something like that until we're ready to complete it. And so to start with, we're just going to do a simple pyramid roof and chisel that up, and then work on putting curtains around. When you're placing curtains, sometimes you'll see there's a little bit of a gap, especially with darker materials. If you replace that inner pillar with the padded block, it won't look out of place and it will get rid of that gap. And you can also just chisel up the rest of that line to give it a little bit more of that marquee effect. And so with marquee tents, we have a little bit more opportunity to branch out and do awnings and things like that because they look good and they make sense. So here we've done a front awning, but you can also split up roofs like this into two smaller pyramids, which still looks very marquee style. And just a quick aside before we start the big tent, a great way to get a smoke effect in your bonfire is to get a torch tree, dig down 4 and put a piece of grating over it. It doesn't necessarily have to be green, but you'll see here it gives an extra dimension to a bonfire. So the next bit is definitely more complicated, so we'll do the base and then the roof last. And for this, we're not really doing a true circle. We're going to do about 8 across and a line of 4 diagonal, and we're going to turn that into kind of a circle, and using our fierce fountains, we're going to create the diagonal side. So this will be more hexagonal rather than circle. So we're filling the straight edges with chalk, knowing we'll probably want to put curtains on them later, and we'll replace them with wooden grating after that. Now when we start adding these fierce fountains, it's not going to always work the same depending on your size. You'll have to play with it, but essentially what we're going to do is we're going to put the fierce fountains all down to create a edge, and I've bordered it with the logs to make it a little bit more round, and we've kept that inside chalk as well because that helps us easily place the fountains. And then once we've done that on the outside, we can go through and we're only going to put 2 rows on the inside and put another layer of logs. That's actually more so that we can make sure that there's no weird visual from the front, and just be careful, obviously, like you can see while you're doing it. So to do that ground floor, it looks more complex than it is because you've got a lot of grating and fountains going on, but really we're just trying to create a hexagon and bordering those diagonal sides with the fierce fountains and bordering each of the edges with big logs and smaller logs for the straight edges. With something this big, it's a good idea to do it on the ground and blueprint it over. It's also a good idea to use chalk blocks, again, like the tent, so you know which parts are the cross and which parts are the corners. And it's easy to make a lot to test something with. It's always going to feel too like it's a really big structure when you're doing a roof like this, but just stick with it, 10, 12 high. It's not going to look out of place on the structure when it's on there. So I kind of just went one up to get a general idea of how high I wanted it to be, and once I was happy with the height of the middle pillar, I got rid of all of that and started doing like we did for the camping tents, 2 down, 2 down, and once I got to the bottom, I worked my way back up to make that curve more curvy, really. When making round structures, if you have any knowledge of pixel art, it does help. And I've put a link to someone great in the description who can explain how you can make curved lines out of blocks. And so we don't want to go around and do the other sides until we're happy with one side, because that way it's going to be much easier to just replicate the other 3 sides, and we might need to play around a little bit. Again, this is always probably going to be different depending on the size of what you're doing. And once I'm kind of happy with the curve of that cone shape, I can go around and do the rest of the lines. This isn't perfect at this point or exactly how it turns out, but it's definitely good enough to replicate the other 4 sides and start on the corners. And now the first thing we want to do before starting the corners is change everything outside of that cross shape to a different color to help us differentiate between those sections while we're making the curve. Now we can start going around like with the camping tents and starting those corner pillars one down from the cross pillars. And so when doing the corner parts, I decided to go around and do each side identical as I was going down. Even though I knew I was going to change the whole thing, at this point it made it easier to make sure that everything was identical. And we're just working down 2 by 2 like we originally did with the yellow part, and then we'll try and expand out once we've filled that bottom section. And the reason I've done it this way is because now that we've got more of a complete 3D structure, it's going to be easier to get a visual eye of what it's going to look like in the end, even though it's not chiseled. And so it's going to help us to have all of that bottom part filled, and then we just go around and we can play then part by part, seeing what's going to work and then replicate it. In terms of expanding it out and making it look even, you want to use a similar idea to going vertical. You want to kind of try and go 2 in at some sections and then 1 in at some sections. Now the frame's done, we can go ahead and use our trowel to change it all to our desired material. For us, it's going to be canvas. And it'll take a little while to get it all done. In the end, it ended up being about 320 pieces, I think, of padded white floor, but once we chisel it in again, I think the effect's really worth it. Now I think it's a good idea at this point, like with the small tents, chisel down your flat diagonals of your cross first, all of them, and then start on your corner pieces. My experience of testing this was definitely that it's very easy to get confused if you don't make yourself an order when making something this big with this many different types of curves. So an unintended consequence of doing it in the chalk that ended up being something I liked was when we do these corner pieces, we end up seeing in some sections the green and yellow underneath. At first, I was not happy with that, and then I realized it actually adds a really nice effect. So you could always go through and just chip out those blocks and change them to white blocks, or just try and go through and stand on those areas and use trowel. But I think it adds a little bit of detail to this roof. So what we're going to actually end up doing is getting ourselves some green and yellow padded blocks, and we're going to go and we're actually going to chip out the white blocks and replace them with padded blocks, just to give it a proper effect like it really is all part of a tent. Now once we've gone and chipped out all the diagonals, you'll see the pieces that are sticking up, and we're going to use our concave chisel for them. So all those triangular bits sticking out towards you, you want to swap to our concave and push them in, and again that's really going to help look like it is a big piece of canvas structured over wood. And now at this point it is pretty much done. So that took me about an hour, but probably after about a couple of hours of practicing on smaller structures. I really liked this as well, so we're going to take it over and blueprint it into my forest, and then I'll take you on a tour. One of the great things about blueprinting in a settlement area is something like this will be chiseled for you, so if you want to recreate it, you don't have to chisel the whole thing again. Just super handy. Alright, so let's have a look at the forest. It's a pretty biodiverse area, and we've used a lot of different trees, plants and mushrooms and shifting sand to put the lanterns in the trees. First we'll go up to our marquee tent, and we've turned that into a luncheon area. So this is where people meet and hang out, and this is all within the settlement area and usable. People do come out and hang out here. Malroth sort of plays around with the pot sometimes. And this is a little bit too small to be functional, but I've just put a little tent over here and a little rest area for an aesthetic. As you can see, I've started chiseling down some additional detail as well. Now we've got our first tents that we made, and both of these have people living in them. I think we've got Lillian and one of the singers in here. And we've made it an area with a fisherman's cook station so that people eat down here, and I made sure to put food in the pancakes in the decorative food so people come and use all of this stuff. And lastly, we have our big tent, And a few fun features. I've got my little hidden friend in a tree. We've got a fishing dock, which is, we can put more fish in there later, but for now, just for the aesthetic, I put a few goldfish in there because we've always got some. A little fish design area, so it's like hanging using the display hooks. Got a picnic area and like a ring toss as well. I got that one on the pole just with a magnetic block. And so in here, using stone doorways, and we can put the wooden bridge underneath them to make them more decorative, we've managed to turn this into multiple rooms. So the main section is a pub, but this little section here is actually a tiny music hall, and I'm going to turn this into a room as well. And there is a darty party over in the corner, which is technically not part of the pub, but that's all right because it's still a set, so people still use it. I've also got a little potable plant back here. I need to grab someone to work in it, but that way we can always have drinks. And people have definitely been using all this stuff, including the toilet over here. This isn't technically our room, but if you keep a toilet outside of a room, people will use it, so keep that in mind to keep your room limits down. And so there's more forest up the top of the hill, but that's not done yet. That is pretty much going to be it for our tour. I'm going to go do some more traditional architecture types in the next couple of days, like Japanese and maybe a beach house style. But if there's any particular styles you want to see first, just let me know. I do have to record them still, so it'll probably take a couple of days, but I'll see you guys around on the groups and Twitter and Facebook.